Welcome back to Kings of the North. Doug Lesmerises and Bill Landis. It is Spring Football Mega Preview Part 2. We have 26 Northern teams that we claim here on Kings of the North. We've done 13 Landis. We covered them 2 weeks ago. Those were the 13 Northern teams that were starting spring football practice the earliest. All of them have launched by this point, and then we saved the second show for the next 13. A few of them have started this week. Some of them have not yet started. We're going to do the same thing we did last time, which is maybe like 5 to 7 minutes per team. We talk about how many they have back of their top 35 players last year, top 35 in number of snaps on offense and defense, any coaching changes, head coach or assistants that were made. And then additionally, when do they start spring practice? When is their spring game? And what's their big issue question of spring? And so that's what we're talking about here. And we are going to start with the defending national champions, and we're going to end with the team they beat in the national championship game. So Michigan will kick us off. Washington will wrap us up. And then in between, we have a lot of great teams to talk about. West Virginia, Iowa State, Wisconsin, all kinds of interesting folks. But before we dive in, Bill, to what we want to talk about in spring football for Michigan, we do want to talk about something we haven't talked about yet on this show, which is Tony Alford leaving Ohio State to go to Michigan, running backs coach to running backs coach, and I guess run game coordinator also at Michigan. As people know, you and I got our start here covering Ohio State. We do an Ohio State local show still. And so we covered it sort of from an Ohio State standpoint this week pretty heavily. But what does this tell you about Michigan? Because we recently saw two Michigan assistants. When Ryan Day took over to Ohio State, he hired Al Washington and Greg Madison straight off Michigan's staff, right? And so there's a part of this that's like, hey, anybody changing sides in the rivalry, how can you do that? But now, an Ohio State assistant going to Michigan, is that another indication in your mind at all about the state of the rivalry when Michigan can be plucking coaches off Ohio State staff?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's a reminder of Michigan's new standing in the rivalry. Right? I don't know. I don't think you would have seen an Ohio State assistant go to Michigan like during that kind of 15-year-ish period, right, where Ohio State kind of dominated the rivalry, because it would have been seen as like at best a lateral move and probably a step down, I think, based off of where the two programs were, how the rivalry was going, Michigan's ability to compete for national championships and that kind of thing. So like it is, not that Michigan needed the validation because it just won the national championship. There is no greater validation than that. But I do think that it further enforces it, maybe like for a coach to like be at Ohio State, see an opportunity at Michigan. I think like that, maybe that's a better opportunity for me. I think probably does say something about the trajectory that Michigan is on, even at a time where it is going through, a serious amount of transition with Jim Harbaugh leaving and Sherrod Moore taking over.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. Sometimes I do like it in sports when people behave as if winning the championship is just a good thing because it allows you to do other things as opposed to the end goal. It's like Michigan was saying, like, you know what? If we win the national championship, we might be able to steal Ohio State's running backs coach.
Right.
Like, that's the real end game here. It's like now Sherrod Moore is sitting back and is like, the plan is complete. Yeah, I mean, the trophy's nice, but we got Tony Alford. But I do think it says something, and like Michigan clearly right now is a place of great opportunity, right? It's like, but again, of course not. Like it's not a black hole. It's not a place to be avoided. It's not a place of uncertainty. And like even in a world where they just lost their head coach and they lost so many great players, I do think there's a little bit of a reinforcement of like, hey, Michigan's like a good place to be right now. So like strategically, like in the rivalry, do you think Sherrod Moore, and it's interesting, right? It's like Mike Hart, who is a great all-time Wolverine, leaves, and that's how this opening comes to be, right? Like last year when Jim Harbaugh was suspended and they sort of had a rotation in the first part of the year, the first time he was suspended, there were multiple people who were acting as the head coach for part of a game. And Mike Hart was part of that rotation, right? Along with Sherrod Moore. And then Sherrod Moore took over and ran the whole thing at the end. But it was interesting to see Mike Hart leave. It's a really good, like, it's a good answer, because I do think for Michigan, in another world, if you're not taking Ohio State's running backs coach, maybe the story of this transition is, oh man, Mike Hart. And I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert on exactly what happened there. But like, again, that's whenever somebody who was a great player in your program and then was brought back to be a coach. And I think there are some people who maybe thought down the line, maybe Mike Hart's the future Michigan head coach someday.
Mm-hmm.
And instead, like, that's not the story right now, right? The story is Tony Alford, not Mike Hart leaving.
No, I don't think I've seen anything about Mike Hart leaving. Everything I've read is about Sharon Moore kind of. I guess he won the game right as the interim coach, so that was probably like the first shot he's fired in the rivalry. But like this is the first one since he's been like the full-time head coach, no question about it. So yeah, I don't know. Like, would Michigan have gotten bad publicity for Mike Hart leaving? I'm not entirely sure, but it's an awkward conversation, like an awkward departure that it's totally overshadowed now by the fact that they stole Ohio State's running backs coach. And it's funny to me too, because like as you said, like we do a lot of Ohio State stuff, and like Ohio State fans, I think rightfully so, have like sort of mixed feelings on Tony Alford. But if you could like put yourself in the shoes of Michigan, I think yourself like, we need a running backs coach. Who's on the short list? It's like Tony Alford is on everyone's short list if they're looking for like the best running backs coaches in America, best running back coaches in America. So like if Ohio State fans are sort of like rolling their eyes at the idea of this being like some kind of monumental thing for Michigan, I would ask you to like change your perspective a little bit if you could, to understand why it might feel a little bit differently for Michigan.
This is something sometimes I think is like, is this just like how I think? Is this just how people like us think? Or do people watching the show and thinking this and listening to the show think this way? Do you like looking up random college football history in the off season? Do you enjoy that? Is that a thing that you do?
Yeah, I do it time to time. Yeah.
So the Bentley Historical Library with the University of Michigan just is a great resource for the Ohio State-Michigan rivalry. And if you just type in like Michigan, Ohio State, Bentley Historical Library stuff, like you'll find all kinds of stuff in there. They do have a page on their website called Michigan versus Ohio State, playing both sides of the field. And it is a history of people who have been associated with both Ohio State and Michigan. It's the best resource I found for something like this, because I think a lot of people, when this happened with Tony Alford, were saying like, well, what's the comp for this? And it's like, okay, well, Bo Schembechler is what immediately leaps to mind, because he was a grad assistant at Ohio State. He was an assistant coach at Ohio State with Woody Hayes for a long time. But he didn't go directly, right? I mean, he was at Miami of Ohio as the head coach before he went to Michigan. So that's not like not an immediate jump. I think the one that people bring up recently, again, we talked about Greg Madison and Al Washington. Justin Boren as a player, that was a huge deal 15 years ago when after Lloyd Carr left and Rich Rodriguez took over. Justin Boren, who's from the Columbus area and whose dad played at Michigan, moved from Michigan to Ohio State. Then his two younger brothers both played at Ohio State. Like the Boren family went from a Michigan family to an Ohio State family. In terms of like trying to find a comp for this, again, like Gary Moeller, we know, was an Ohio State player before he was the Michigan head coach. But in terms of like assistants like this, I think you might have to go back to, this is the kind of stuff where I like to find stuff like this. You know, good old Steve Farrell was an assistant football trainer and the track coach at Ohio State from 1909 to 1912. And then he was the assistant football coach and the trainer at Michigan and the head track coach from 1913 to 1929. So that's a direct move. 1912, he's at Ohio State. 1913, he's at Michigan. And I just like saying old stuff. But that's what we're talking about. We're talking about something we're not sure this has happened for more than 100 years.
So we can call this like the Farrell Alford scale when we're trying to determine how monumental a move from between Ohio State and Michigan is.
Playing both sides, yeah. And like again, like, you know, people understand what Ohio State Michigan is there, but it's like Jabbar Muhammad, right, was one of Washington's best defensive players last year. He transferred to Oregon this year, right? Yeah. I mean, there are times when it's like it's not like the only time, but like in this rivalry, like it's pretty rare. People made a big deal. Joey Velasquez was on Michigan's roster and then showed up at Ohio State this year as like a 5th or 6th year college player. I think he's not even on scholarship, right? But
he's
like
a walk-on,
they put him on the list. The Bentley Historical Library put him on the list. So like you're putting walk-on linebackers on the list because being on both sides of the rivalry is such a big deal. The 9-year running backs coach 9-year running backs coach. So yeah, it's a big deal. And I do think, I think it is more like interesting for Ohio State than maybe damaging for Ohio State. But I do think it's like a little bit of a power move by Michigan, right? Like I think it's I think it's all good for Michigan, and it's kind of weird and mostly weird for Ohio State. So it's not like good and bad. It's like good and weird. But I do think it's definitively good for Michigan to do this.
Yeah, I think so too. But I don't like you said. I don't necessarily think that's bad for Ohio State. Like we'll see what Ohio State does to replace Tony Alford, right? Like if they swing and miss on like their top 5 candidates and then have to settle for somebody that didn't necessarily want, then I guess it becomes bad for Ohio State. But I don't think that's going to happen. So
power.
Yeah, it's a power move for Michigan. It's like, I don't know, the optics of it, I guess, aren't great for Ohio State, but I think Ohio State will rebound just fine.
Yeah. Bigger deal. So, but national championship, bigger deal. Tony Alford second.
Close though. Yeah.
Yeah. All right, let's go to Michigan. We're going to run through the 13 teams on the Spring Football Mega Preview Part 2, and we are going to start with the Michigan Wolverines, who did start spring practice this week. They started on Monday. They have their spring game on April 20th. I may or may not plan to be there. Say hey to Tony Alford, possibly. They did wind up with 7 new assistants this year. So Sharon Moore obviously is taking over for Jim Harbaugh. A bunch of the defensive assistants went to the NFL with Jim Harbaugh, led by Jesse Minter, the defensive coordinator. So Steve Klinkscale also left. So did Mike Elston. So like a lot of change. There's no defensive coaches who are back. That is all new. A couple of the offensive guys have stuck around, but people are in new positions. Kirk Campbell, quarterback's coach, got elevated to offensive coordinator. Grant Newsome, the tight ends coach, became the offensive line coach because Sharon Moore used to be the offensive line coach. Like there's not, I think Ron Bellamy is the only guy who's still there in the same spot. So a lot of change. 15 of the 35 guys back. So they wiped it out, right? They might have 18 guys drafted, right? They wiped out the top of this roster. So you have someone like Colston Loveland at tight end back. You have somebody like Donovan Edwards back. You have Will Johnson at corner is an All-American candidate. But the big thing to me, Landis, when we think about what Michigan's going to be looking for this spring is when you think of Michigan and what they've done these last three seasons, do you think offense first or defense first?
Well, I think because of Jim Harbaugh, I still might think offense first, but like, I get what you're saying. Like, I actually do think the foundation of their success, like on the field the last couple of years has actually been just how good their defense has been.
So it felt like the big sea change for Michigan was when Jim Harbaugh fired Don Brown, the longtime defensive coordinator, and brought in fresh blood. And it's like, it is blood because he got it from his brother, John Harbaugh, with the Baltimore Ravens. And what Michigan did was adapt this defensive philosophy that had been developed with the Baltimore Ravens. So the big question here is Wink Martindale, who was the defensive coordinator for John Harbaugh with the Baltimore Ravens, who sort of established the defensive identity there. 2 of his young assistants in Baltimore were Mike McDonald and Jesse Minter, who were the defensive coordinators for this Michigan run the last 3 years. Mike McDonald was only there for a year, and he was so good he left. And again, this is old ground for Michigan fans, but Mike McDonald goes from the Ravens to Michigan. He had learned under Wink Martindale. Then John Harbaugh's like, Wink, I think we're good, and takes Mike McDonald back in Baltimore after 1 year at Michigan. And then Jesse Minter comes in as the defensive coordinator the last 2 years. Now Mike McDonald is the head coach of the Seattle Seahawks, and Jesse Minter is Jim Harbaugh's defensive coordinator with the LA Chargers. Okay. So what they do is they get Wink Martindale back. So the question is, can they keep this defense sort of humming? Wink Martindale, as spring practice was starting, Bill said, I think on a radio show, like, I'm the OG.
Yeah.
Like, if you're worried about, can we keep this going? Hey, like, I created this sort of defensive idea where there's a lot of movement right at the snap of the ball. You're changing the picture for the quarterback. It can be really aggressive. You can wind up maybe only bringing 4 rushers in a play, but you might be dropping the defensive tackles and bringing a corner as one of the 4 rushers. There's a lot to that. I think, you hear people talk I think like part of the appeal of like even Jim Harbaugh in the NFL was like this defensive system that you knew, even though he's not a defensive coach, you knew he'd be bringing that defensive system to the NFL. So Wink Martindale is the guy to run it. Mike McDonald's 36, Jesse Minter's 40, Wink Martindale is 60. We like old people. I'm old. So it's not about that, but Wink Martindale hasn't been a college coach since 2003. He's been in the NFL for 2 decades. He's certainly at a different place in his career. Like the scheme is the same. I'm very, at least curious, and it starts this spring to see how the OG runs this system when he just hasn't been coaching at this level with 18-year-olds instead of 26-year-old millionaires for 20 years.
Yeah, no, that's where I am too. Like the system works for sure. We have definitive proof that the system works, and we have proof too that guys can learn the system. But is Wink Martindale equipped to teach it to 18-year-olds, right? When he's been doing it for so long with adults in the NFL. And like I do think that's a major difference, right? I think there's a different way of having to go about teaching this stuff in college and the NFL. Surely there's some overlap, but I really don't know that there's much, especially when you've been away from the college game as long as Wink Martindale has. And like I think it matters that Mike McDonald and Jesse Minter were like a little younger. When it comes to like imparting that. I guess the good thing for Michigan is like, yes, this roster is turning over, but I think there's probably enough back on defense that like Wink Martindale doesn't have to come in and like teach a bunch of guys who haven't played like on the field in the game in the system before. So that'll give him like a year, I think, to kind of figure out exactly how to tweak his way of teaching the system and installing it at the college level. So like I'm not very concerned about this. Like, I think it's worth saying out loud, right? I think it's worth pointing out and being a little skeptical of, but I mostly err on the side of like, this system works. There's a lot of guys back. I think Michigan will keep humming on the defensive side of the ball, even if it's like a little bit of a risk to bring in Wink Martindale as opposed to like, I don't know, whoever the version of Jesse Minter was on the Baltimore Ravens staff at the time that Sherrone Moore was making this hire.
You know, I do think in the end it's probably a smart move because I think what you're doing here is you're bringing in Wink Martindale and then you want to help groom the next Mike McDonald or Jesse Minter, right? That there's somebody on this staff that if Wink Martindale's 60, he's not going to be the defensive coordinator at Michigan for the next 20 years. So who can you help be next to keep this system in place? And one of the things that I do think when we're talking about like all the great players that Michigan lost, they did a really good job last year. They really had maybe like 17 to 18 guys who were sort of like primary parts of their defense in a real way. So even when you're losing your top end guys like Mike Sainristil and Junior Colson and Chris Jenkins and Braden McGregor and Jalen Harrell and guys like that, you're like, for instance, up front, they lose Jalen Harrell and Braden McGregor, who are their top 2 defensive ends, but Derek Moore, who's back as the third guy, played almost as many snaps as them. And they had a 4-man rotation at defensive tackle. So even though you lost Chris Jenkins, Mason Graham is back and Kenneth Grant is back, right? You have Will Johnson back. You have Makari Page and Rod Moore back in the secondary. Like, they're down a bunch of starters, but they almost had 17 starters on defense. So even if you lose 10 of those guys, there is a baseline here. I think I think other teams can learn from this. Again, it speaks to their depth of talent that you can lose so much and still have so much, but they were smart to play it. I think it helped them keep them fresh for the end of the year, but you have to have that many guys you believe in. But again, like, I think you have like a foundation, you know, Ernest Hausman. Okay. They lost their their starting 2 linebackers and Colson and Barrett, but Ernest Hausman was kind of like their third linebacker and he's ready to step right in because he played as like a co-starter almost. So they were very smart in how they went about it last year. And the result is they lost so much, but they're still, I think, ready for this in like ready for what's next in a far more significant way than, for instance, Washington is.
Oh, yeah. Washington doesn't have anything close to this. Yeah. No, it is like, it's interesting because I do think there is a bit of a narrative out there about just how much Michigan's roster is turning over that I think is overstated. Like it's true, I think, mostly on the offensive side, starting with JJ McCarthy, obviously, but on defense, I I don't buy it. Like I think they're going to run it back and be really good on defense. Like if you just ran through all the positions there, like the only one that's like kind of turning over is linebacker. And as you mentioned, like Curtis Houseman played a decent amount last year, and the other linebacker is probably going to be Jay Sean Barham from Maryland, who's played a lot of football. Like not in the system, like he has to learn it, but I really think they're going to be okay. Maybe they're like slightly worse off than they were last year, but I still think this is a top 10 defense. It's part of the reason why, like I think Michigan, while its schedule is incredibly difficult and maybe it drops 2 games this year, or perhaps even 3, I think it still has a great chance of making the playoff because I still expect this to be one of the best defenses in the country.
So the reason I made this a thing in the end is that it's not about age, but it's whenever someone's not in college football for 20 years, my eyebrow is raised when they come back, especially when you think about how much college athletes and how much the college game and the way that coaches relate to athletes has changed since 2003. 2003 at Western Kentucky. And now he's been in the NFL. And so if he has just an idea of sort of like how things work, it's like a lot has changed, Wink. So I'm not saying I wouldn't have done it, but I'm saying I'm curious to see if there's any kind of disconnect. But, you know, again, he's the sort of the coordinator. You have the other coaches who have their hands on the guys much more. So I don't think it's a problem. I think it's a curiosity for Michigan this spring. All right.
Yeah.
Colorado is next. Colorado also started spring practice this week. They started on Monday. Their spring game is April 27th. They have 19 of their top 35 back. They did have like everyone knows a decent amount of turnover. A lot of those guys who left, it's not just guys who graduated, it's people heading out to other schools as transfers. They brought in like another boatload of transfers, especially in the area that we're going to talk about the most. And they changed over half their coaching staff. So they have a new defensive coordinator, Robert Livingston, they got from the Cincinnati Bengals. We've talked about that on a previous show. They have a new offensive line coach that we're going to talk about. You know, they made the move in the middle of last year, moving out Sean Lewis as the play caller. Pat Shurmur moved in there. He's now back as the play caller. So I feel this is like a pretty significant sort of reset for Deion Sanders in Colorado, that it's almost like year 1, part 2. Yeah, as opposed to like year 2. This is like a pretty, it's Deion and it's his 2 sons are still the same, and Travis Hunter is still there, and like almost so many other pieces around them that really matter changed.
It's a lot of coaching turnover for year 2, right? Like, I don't like 5 new assistants after 1 year, and I'm not saying he should have made the changes. It's just like it seems like a high number.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's slightly unusual. One of the guys they lost Nick Williams. I think that was a really good hire for Fran Brown at Syracuse. So that was like, I don't think that was necessarily something they were looking for. I think they decided to make a change at defensive coordinator. They decided to make a change on the offensive line. And we're going to focus on the offensive line because they're rebuilding it. So that's our big issue, our big question for the offensive, for Colorado in the spring is they only have 1 offensive line starter back. That's because 3 of the starters from last year transferred out. So like they knew they wanted to change something here. And here's what they've added. They added 5 guys in the transfer portal who were starters at other schools last year. So like that is a huge deal. They added Tyler Johnson from Houston, Justin Mays from UTEP, Yakiri Walker from UConn, Khalil Benson from Indiana, and Philip Houston from Florida International. 2 guards, a center, and 2 tackles. And they all played between 648 and 810 snaps last year. So these are full-time dudes. So that's 5 new guys. They have 1 existing starter back at right tackle in Savion Washington, who will be in that battle there. And then they added Jordan Seaton, who, when we did our 10 most interesting guys of spring for All the North, 5-star left tackle candidate, he was one of those guys. So they weren't good enough last year. But now they have 7 guys, 1 who played for them, 5 who played elsewhere, and a 5-star freshman. And they have Phil Lodeholt, who was a former NFL star, who has never been a full-time assistant before, but had been at Oklahoma, had been at Ole Miss, is a native of Colorado. They brought him back to coach this group at this level for the first time. And Deion told him what's up, right? Shedeur Sanders got sacked 52 times last year. That's not good enough. They're bringing back a young coach, former NFL star, and a whole new raft of guys. Do you think it's going to work?
I think it's going to be better. Like I would be shocked if it's not better because it's hard to be worse. But no, I think they like attack this pretty well. I'm still in the camp of like they need to be more intentional about recruiting and developing offensive linemen in that program. But like as a quick fix in year 2 to address what was your most glaring issue last year, I think they've actually done a pretty nice job here, including the coaching hire. Like the coaching hire, I find intriguing. Like I like maybe you want somebody more experienced to come in and kind of take this over to help reshape it. But I also kind of like that, like Phil Lodeholt did spend time at Oklahoma with Bill Beatembo, who's like maybe the best offensive line coach in college football. And he was there for 2 years, I think. So like, I kind of like just like kind of marinating in that environment for a little bit and then like coming to Colorado and trying to make this thing better. So I think they will be like at worst, like serviceable. But there's also there's at least 2 guys here, I think, with Tyler Johnson and Jordan Seaton, who have like really high upside too. So I think it's possible they take like a tremendous step forward on the offensive line.
I think the Phil Lodeholt hire like is really good because this is one of those where, you know, I can pound the table a lot of the times when I feel like schools are hiring guys who aren't qualified.
Mm-hmm.
But I think fairly recent NFL player who's, you know, paid his dues a little bit, working at some programs, but hasn't been a full-time assistant before is like a great hire. Because with my own eyeballs, I've seen like that Brian Hartline was that. And Brian Hartline, never full-time assistant in college before, immediately turned into one of the best position coaches in college football as the receivers coach at Ohio State. Mike Vrabel was that. Mike Vrabel like retired for the NFL and got hired as a full-time assistant at Ohio State and very quickly rose up the ladder and was an NFL head coach in short order. But he started off as an assistant coach at Ohio State. So like, I think Phil Lodeholt could be this. And it's one of those things where I think Deion Sanders, there's probably a little too much uncertainty and upheaval, right? I think he's got to lock the program down a little bit. But we also live in a world where there are a lot of coaches out there who are more than willing to let a program go stale, who are more than willing to hire people they know and feel bad about letting them go and not hold people to a standard. So yeah, it feels like 5 different assistant coaches from a year ago is a lot. But on the other hand, they went 4-8. They weren't very good after September. And he said, like, we're not doing this. We're going to be better here. And so anything, you identify the problem and you get after it, trying to fix it. It doesn't mean it's going to work. They got after it. And I am super interested to see what the word is. And listen, Phil Lodeholt, after their first practice, was talking about, hey, we're leaning on the experience of this transfer. They don't have experience at Colorado, but they have a lot of guys who played. You know, they have a lot of guys who played. And as you said, some of them pretty high level. Khalil Benson, in the end, is like, he's a good Big Ten offensive lineman. He'll help Colorado. So I like the idea. I almost like every parts of the idea of the thing that held them back. And if they get this straightened out, they might win 8 games. Because Travis Hunter and Shadur Sanders and some of the other receivers they have are like really good.
No, I think you're right. I guess the thing that it does is, so like if Colorado would have just been like, okay, like, hey, we improved from 1 win to 4 wins. And like, I know it wasn't great, but that's improvement in Colorado. We're going to keep this thing together and keep moving forward. And like, you don't show any progress. That's like one thing. But if you're as aggressive as they were this offseason, like retooling things after 1 year, and then the results are the same, then it's sort of, you're inviting like, does this guy know what he's doing? I think kind of questions, which like it's a risk that I think was the right one to take, but it's like a risk nonetheless. Like I do think like Deion has sort of increased the scrutiny with such a dramatic makeover after 1 year.
I agree, but I think I would prefer it to, we'll figure it out.
Yeah. So would I. Yeah.
So, all right. So watch the offensive line at Colorado this spring. Again, they started on Monday. They are underway. Next school we're going to do is Illinois. And I'm not sure about Illinois. They also have started. They started on March 19th, which was Tuesday of this week. Their spring game is April 20th. They only have 14 back of their top 35 guys from a year ago. They have 4 new assistants. A couple that Brett Bielema decided to move on from, a couple other guys that decided to move on their own. I am concerned about where Illinois is right now, because one of the things is that I think they had 6 guys invited to the NFL Combine, which maybe was as many as Illinois ever had, off a team that didn't make a bowl.
Yeah.
So sometimes when you're evaluating like off seasons of teams and you're like, hey, they had nobody invited to the combine. They had one guy invited to the combine. It's like, oh, good. They didn't lose that much talent. There's not a lot. Maybe there's guys graduating, but it's not guys that the NFL is like all excited to go draft. So Illinois actually lost some dudes and wasn't that good with those dudes. And for like 20 people out of your top 35 back is probably average for what I've done with the research on this. 14 back off of like a not very good team is not a good place to start. And then you look at the big issue for me, which is the defensive line, because Jerzon Newton was one of the best players in the North last year. And like you didn't really win with him. So he's going to be maybe a first round pick. They also lost Keith Randolph as an interior defensive lineman who's also going to get drafted. They lost another guy. I think they lost 5 of their top 6 defensive tackles in snaps last year. They brought in some guys in the portal, but they kind of made their name the last couple of years with the kind of player Newton was inside, and Randolph was pretty good too. And so I think to keep Illinois, I like to make sure Illinois doesn't fall off a cliff. They've got to patch this hole on the defensive line.
Yeah.
But I'm like just kind of nervous about Illinois generally. So curious to see how they look this spring.
Yeah, I mean, it does feel like it's going in the wrong direction. And I don't know. They were so good defensively 2 years ago before Ryan Walters left for Purdue.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if I'd say the defensive line was like the engine of that, but clearly the defensive line was part of it. And they went from number 3 in defensive efficiency to number 81 in defensive efficiency last year. And when you're remaking the defensive line the way they have to now, like, yeah, I get really nervous about that. And I don't know. It just feels like maybe Brett Bielema like doesn't have a firm grasp on the roster and like kind of where it needs to be, which I think is understandable earlier in your tenure, but we're at the point now where I feel like that's kind of inexcusable. So yeah, I'm likewise a little nervous about them. Certainly starting with the defensive line, but I agree with you just sort of more generally, like, is this thing going the way that it needs to be going? And frankly, I'm a little surprised that we're asking those questions because I like the Brett Bielema hire at the time it was made.
They brought in 3 defensive line transfers: Dennis Briggs Jr. from Florida State, Anthony Johnson from Youngstown State, and Anise Sledge from Auburn. And they did a nice thing. They had like little introductory social media videos where they had those guys sit down and talk to the camera. And clearly, like what Jerzon Newton had done the last couple of years caught the eye, especially the guys from Florida State and Auburn. Like, hey, look, they helped this guy develop. He's a monster. He's going to be a first-round pick. That got them interested in coming to Illinois. They also signed a guy who was the number 1 JUCO edge guy. Now, they do have some of their edge guys back. They have Seth Coleman back. They have a couple other guys back at edge. Their hole is really at defensive tackle. But Daniel Brown last year in 10 junior college games had 17.5 sacks. And they signed him, or he agreed to come to Illinois like the day after the season ended last year. So they've been on him. That was a good get. If he comes in, and I mean, you can't compare. It's like, hey, Jared Verse played at Albany and then was a superstar at Florida State. So like every small school guy who makes a jump up is not going to be Jared Verse. But 17.5 sacks is a lot. Almost like 1.75 sacks a game at any level is a lot. So, they've had some guys and they just need to find more guys. But so it starts on the defensive line, but it's really a spring to make sure Illinois is not tilting, the leaning tower of Champagne, right? Like Brett Bielema is like, are they tilting? Are you tilting?
Brett Bielema strikes me as a guy who's gone to a restaurant before and ordered the leaning tower of Champagne.
Yeah. Man, we really, like top end of what Kings of the North could become. We are the owner of a successful chain of sports bars throughout the North and college towns, right?
Yeah. That's exactly. What do you like? Where? Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just getting excited about what else we're going to put on the menu. But go ahead.
Oh no, I'm like what? I know Brett Bielema, I believe, is like on the hot seat, but 5-7 last year. If they're around the same record this year, it's get a little iffy for him there. You think?
Yeah, it's one of those things, right? The Big Ten West is not a thing anymore. Doesn't exist anymore as we know it. But I still think when you think about who Illinois' cohorts are, like that's still the kind of schools you're going to compare them to. So it's like, okay, Nebraska and Wisconsin are in year 2 of big-time head coaching hires and maybe ready to make a jump with Matt Rule and Luke Fickell. Okay. Ryan Walters is also in year 2. He was a younger guy who had never been a head coach before at Purdue, but like maybe if he gets something together, again, as you said, he was part of Illinois' success. Kurt Cignetti, right? Jonathan Smith at Indiana and Michigan State are new exciting hires in the Big Ten that people are excited about, right? Kirk Ferentz has a great team back at Iowa. He's been around forever. So like, what's Brett Bielema? He's not new and exciting anymore. He's not locked in and established like Kirk Ferentz or maybe even like PJ Fleck. He's kind of in the middle. So he would like to be on the path. I mean, he was young and exciting before. What he did at Wisconsin was tremendous. But I don't think it's like hot seat, but I think Illinois fans, boosters, donors, administration, you could look around and say, well, we're not that, and that's pretty good, and we're not that, and that's pretty exciting. Like, what are we?
Yeah.
So you've got to, it's, winning is exciting, but you've got to show, I think, that there's like a plan and there's an end game and there's a light at the end of the tunnel for Illinois football. And like treading water around trying to win 6 games to make a bowl is not what Illinois football wants to be.
No. And it's, I think also like the schools that you mentioned there, like a lot of them seem like they're taking bigger swings maybe than they have in the past to like try to up their game a little bit. And maybe it won't work, but at least they're trying. And I don't, if I'm an Illinois fan, maybe I feel like you're not taking that kind of swing at the moment. And maybe you'd want to.
Yeah. So at Illinois, it starts this spring by replacing Jerzon Newton, who is a once-in-a-generation player at Illinois.
Good luck.
All right. When we come back, we're going to dive into the remaining 10 schools that we have for our spring mega preview, part 2 here on Kings of the North. Doug Lesmerises, Bill Landis back on Kings of the North. We are on to Indiana as part of our spring mega preview. Part 2, the Indiana Hoosiers, new head coach Kurt Cignetti only kept 1 assistant, so it's new head coach, 9 new assistants at Indiana. Only 15 of the top 35 back. That's a lot of guys transferring out, a lot of guys transferring in, which is what we're going to talk about. Opening practice March 21st this week. Spring game on April 18th. And my question about Indiana starting this spring is there such a thing as too much JMU? Which also sounds like something we could put on our menu. Like too much JMU? Like if you eat, well, we'd have to figure out like jalapeno, mayonnaise, upside down, potato skins, right? The JMU potato skins. Oh, the jalapeno, mayonnaise, upside down potato skins. Is there such a thing as too much? Is there too much JMU? JMU last year, 11-2 in the Sun Belt. Like weren't the people talking about like, hey, we should find a way to get them in the playoff, right? Like JMU was a story last year.
Uh-huh.
Kurt Cignetti was the head coach. He comes to Indiana. He brings 7 assistants from JMU. So 7 of the assistants at Indiana are from JMU. They kept 1 guy. 1 guy's from the Denver Broncos, and 1 guy was at Charlotte last year. Okay, so that's a lot of JMU. 9 transfers from JMU to Indiana. It feels like 8 of them might start this year for Indiana. So there's both like the on-field success like this year, and like in year 1, you're just trying to find your way, and it like proof of concept, I think, is a real thing. And you bring in players who believe in the coaches, and they tell the other players on the rosters who are like, hey, who's this Kurt Cignetti guy? And they're like, hey, he's a good coach. Here's why. Hey, these position coaches are good. Here's why. I get it. If you wind up with like more than a third of your starters are guys who started at JMU last year, I just wonder, both from sort of a talent standpoint, what are you trying to be? Is bringing an 11-win Sun Belt team to the Big Ten the way you want to go about it? And would you possibly have the people who have been at Indiana looking around being like, what are we, are we changing the mascot? Are we changing our school colors? Are we, James Indiana University now? Like like, is it too much? Like I knew, right? You knew it was a flavor, but when I was double checking, I was like, man, that's a lot of JMU.
I don't think it's too much. I actually kind of like it.
Oh, look at you. You like a lot of it. So you're getting the potato skins. You're seeing,
I'm definitely getting potato skins.
Jalapeno, mayonnaise, upside down potato skins. If you can eat 30, you get them free. You need 30?
30?
No, 22. There's 22 starters, 11 on each side of the ball. Eat 22. Eat a double starting lineup. So the orders are If you want one starting lineup, you get 11. If you want, the other one's called both sides of the ball. Hey, what do you get? What do you guys want to get to start? You want to get both sides of the ball, the JMU potato skins? Yeah, that sounds good. But if one person eats them themselves, then you get them for free.
I don't think I could put down 22. Potato skins are deceptive.
They're little, potatoes.
Little medallions.
That's eating that's like 6 whole potatoes probably if you eat 22 potato skins.
You don't eat 6 whole potatoes in a jar of mayonnaise.
Right. You've seen the thing, right? Like the comedian. I was watching a comedian who was like, can you imagine if you were sitting at home getting ready to cook dinner and before you ate dinner, you were like, you want to eat half a loaf of bread before we have our dinner? But when you go to a restaurant, it makes total sense to you.
Yeah. Yeah. It is just, yeah, I do eat about, well, for me, eating half a loaf of bread before dinner at home is perfectly normal. I actually,
the normal size of the JMU potato skins, we're going to call the nickel package because that's 5. So it's like 5 DBs. We got 5 DBs in the game. You guys want to get starting lineup, nickel package, or both sides of the ball? It's like definitely not both sides of the ball. You know what? I'm not that hungry. Let's just get the nickel package. We can each have one.
Yeah, and then you can go dime and dollar too if you want to add like 1 or 2 more.
Yeah, right. It's a slide up charge if you want to go down. Does this make sense that this is now the end game, that we have started a YouTube show only to create a menu for a fictional restaurant?
Yeah. We're just creating TGI Fridays. Football themed TGI Fridays.
But northern, and then we'll have to put them in some southern towns where northern expats live, right? So one of those things, there's so many chain restaurants that are like only in the north and Florida.
We're going to be the #1 restaurant in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. I'll tell you that much.
Would you go if you were in Myrtle Beach and there was like, where should we eat? And they're like, I think there's a college football themed restaurant with a sword through the name. It's like, yeah, you and I would be there every meal.
They have 9 different ways you can order potato skins. Yeah, it's really odd. They spend a lot of time on the potato skins.
Yeah, it's like, you want to get the Fran Brown onion ring tree? Like everything. It'd be like every year we'd unveil the new names of the items on the menu because we'd adjust them based on northern players and coaches. We'd be signing NIL deals with guys.
Oh,
Be on our menu.
You could do like Kurt Signetti's from Pittsburgh. You can do like pierogies, like Signetti's, or a sandwich with French fries on it. Either one's fine.
Yeah, and then we'd have to. What's like a good Indiana delicacy that we could have as a side?
Pork tenderloin.
Yeah, so you get the Signetti special. You get a pierogi and a pork tenderloin together.
The pork tenderloin the size of your head.
If we did that and opened it in Bloomington, Kurt Signetti would do his weekly coaches show from
absolutely
Kings of the North Bar and Grille.
Yeah, he would.
Oh man, should we stop the show and just menu plan? Can you cook? Could we make? We have to invite. We'll have a contest now. Invite people to come to your house to sample the future menu items from the.
We can do that. We can do a tasting. Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Jalapeno mayonnaise, upside down potato skins. Too much JMU? You think no? You think Indiana will be okay? This is like, you think it's a good plan or like an accidental plan or like proof of concept? I'm bringing my whole team because we were winners and we're going to win here. Let's do it.
Yeah, no, I think it's that. I think it's like it's an interesting and probably not like all that unique actually. If you go and look at some other coaches who have transferred or not transferred, but have moved up a level and take their jobs, I'm sure this happens. Maybe not quite to this extent. But JMU is like a really good winning program that like has proven concepts on both sides of the ball. Why not bring a bunch of those guys with you to an Indiana team that was suffering from a talent deficiency anyway? Like long term, do you want to be running out Sun Belt talent year after year after year at Indiana? Probably not, because I think Indiana has some lofty goals with Kurt Signetti. But I think in year 1/year 2, I think it's a pretty good way to like immediately up the floor of what Indiana has been, because like it's been a bad program, a bad football team, I should say, the last couple of years, and I think like an injection of this talent that understands the system can kind of expedite the process a little bit of Kurt Signetti getting this to where it wants to go.
I will say I'm a little intrigued. Indiana, of their top 35 players last year, only lost 6 who just like ran out of eligibility. They have 14 transfers. Some of the places where some of their guys have transferred, we talked about Khalil Benson going to Colorado. They lost a guy to Miami, a guy to Ole Miss, a guy to Oregon. 2 guys to Memphis, right? Like, but like, it's looking at where their guys transferred. I was like, I don't know, like maybe this might have been a more talented team than a
Better
3-9
roster.
team last year,
Yeah.
which is why Tom Allen lost his job. So, I think we believe in the hire. We both like the Curt Cignetti hire, and it's just such a transformation. It's just spring is all about implementing what they are. So, I was maybe curious. We know that's the story. Is it possible they could go too far and you say no? Okay, I'll buy it. Syracuse is next. This is, again, we end up, I think, and I like it. We talk about Syracuse and Indiana in tandem a lot because they're coaching hires. They both brought in new coaches. We like both hires. They're both very different. Curt Cignetti, veteran head coach, hired by Indiana. Fran Brown, never been a head coach, hired by Syracuse. 23 of the top 35 back. So again, this is a change, right? Both new programs. Indiana has, what was it, 14 or 15 in the top 35? Mm-hmm. Syracuse has 23. So Syracuse, not as much of a roster change, even though we talked previously about Fadil Diggs and some of the other guys, the defensive transfers they brought in that can make an immediate difference. Obviously, Kyle McCord is a quarterback transfer, immediate difference for Syracuse. But they kept some stuff there. 8 of the 10 new assistants. They also start spring practice this week. They start on March 21st. Their spring game is April 20th. And Fran Brown, among the many interviews, it hasn't been on here yet, we hope to have him on, was talking about he would like to run the ball, right? So this is a guy who, he came from a place at Georgia where Georgia plays 3 running backs. They rotate, they move guys around that, they are not, Georgia has not won national championships with first-round draft pick quarterbacks. It's not an excuse for me to do a Stetson Bennett impersonation. I know you're waiting for it. It's like whenever it comes up, here comes a Georgia quarterback conversation. So my thing I'm curious about this spring is like, can Syracuse sort of establish a run game to be what Fran Brown wants to be? Because again, we're talking about establishing an identity in the spring. My question for Indiana was like, are they establishing too much of an identity? Because the identity is we're a Sun Belt team, but Fran Brown needs to establish an identity at Syracuse, and it sounds like he wants to be able to pound it,
which is like a little surprising to me. I think it's right. Like I almost feel like you have to start there when you're kind of building a program. But they went and got Kyle McCord. They have Aronde Gadsden, who's like, I don't know, basically a receiver playing tight end and potentially like very explosive and very productive. Like it seems like they made
year and back is a huge return for them.
It seems like some of the offensive moves in the offseason were geared more toward throwing the ball than they were running the ball. So does that mean like they have to throw it to run it? Like I'm not entirely sure. But I like the idea. I think the thought process is correct here. I just I don't know. I question a little bit whether or not they're actually built to do it in Fran Brown's first year.
So 4 offensive line starters back, brought in a couple transfers on the offensive line, one from Georgia, brought in a starting tackle from Howard. So I do think it's one of those. It's interesting if you have Ohio State's starting quarterback from last year as your starting quarterback, and you have probably one of the most talented tight ends in the country. So again, can those guys? Part of the issue last year is like Garrett Schrader was a really good running quarterback, but then he was sort of hurt last year, and I think people wound up putting extra guys in the box against Syracuse because they didn't have to respect the pass game when the quarterback wasn't 100%. And LaQuint Allen last year for Syracuse, who was back as their number 1 running back. There were 45 running backs last year in major college football who ran for at least 1,000 yards. He was one of them. He was 38th with 1,064 rushing yards, which is good. But of those 45 guys, he had the second lowest yards per carry at 4.34. So like they were dedicated to it last year, but they weren't that good at it, right? They weren't explosive, and they wound up, the coach got fired as a result. They weren't terrible. They were a mediocre team, but I think they need to be able to loosen things up in the pass game so they can run it more effectively. So I do think it's about tying this together, but if Fran Brown wants to run it, I think last year they wound up like banging their head against the wall a lot of the time, probably because they didn't have that many other options, especially once Gadsden got hurt. But, coaches want to come in and be physical. And part of the reason I picked this is because I think they have an opportunity to do it, right? They have some things in place. Can they be better at it by having more of a passing threat? But I also think it's good that it's not like, hey, we're going to bring in Kyle McCord and try to throw for 350 yards a game. Right.
Yeah,
so,
that's true. Yeah. And it's probably more of a balanced conversation, right? Than it is like maybe wanting to be like run first or predominantly run heavy. Right. I think you would sort of present that as like we want to establish the run, but it's probably more of a conversation about not having to put Kyle McCord in a position to throw for 4,000 yards, or else you're not going to win as much as you want to.
Yeah. All right. Next up is Iowa State. And Iowa State is in a super interesting spot because they have also so much back. 28 of their top 35 back. That's as high as any team I did in the North. And on a future show, we'll compile the all top to bottom in our 26 Northern teams, who has the most back, who has the least. But like Iowa State is who they are. They are also starting spring practice this week on March 21st. Their spring game is on April 20th. 3 new assistants. We've covered that, right? They lost Tyson Veit, their linebackers coach, to be the defensive coordinator at Cincinnati. They lost Nathan Shieldhouse, who'd been their offensive coordinator, to the LA Rams. They've made some internal hires. They were forced to adjust there. This is not like firing guys who aren't getting it done. They're losing guys who are really good. But there is not a lot to learn, I don't think, for Iowa State this spring. They have 18 starters back, 9 on each side of the ball. Utah also has 18 starters back, but like this is in the North, this is about as experienced as you get. But they were 7-6 last year, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there's part of me, it's like, I think there is reason to be enthusiastic about Iowa State, but they have to make sure they improve.
Right.
Are we going to be that kind of show? That's my least favorite kind of sports talk show. It's like, hey, all right, Philly Billy and French Vanelli here back. Hey, man, what's up with the Cyclones? Man, I'm just going to tell you, they got to improve. It's like, oh, we're on the got to improve show. But I don't know that there's a lot to learn. Like, there's a lot in place. So this spring, all they have to do is get better. And if they get better with the guys who played all these games last year and all these snaps, they might win the Big 12. Get better.
Yeah. No, I think if you look at it as like not so much like last year was 7-6, but that last year was an improvement from the year before. And it's like they're stacking that on top. What were they, 4-8? I think the year before. They yeah, right. 2022, they were 4-8.
Yeah. Right.
So 4-8, 7-6, and like then what? Like it's not like 7-6, and then we're running back this mediocre team again. Like I actually think there's reason to be optimistic about them stacking another improvement on top of this year. Just how, like, to what extent can they actually improve? Like, there definitely are areas where they have to get better. I was looking at, like, we were just talking about Syracuse running the ball. Like, Iowa State, I think, for what it wants to do offensively, needs to run the ball, like, better. But, like, they have the most confusing, I think, like, rushing game log that I've ever seen from a team. They have a game where they rush for 0 yards, a game where they rush for 9 yards, a game where they rush for 38 yards, and then 3 games when they rush for more than 200 yards. Like, it doesn't make any sense to me how they were able to, like, on occasional weeks channel one of the most explosive rushing attacks in the country, and then most other weeks are under 100 yards, and a couple of weeks are under 40 yards. Like, and I think most of their offensive line is back. Abu Sam is back at running back. So, like, the pieces are there to, like, build upon some of the successes they were able to find last year. But it's like, if you don't know week to week whether or not you're getting 50 yards or 250 yards, like, that's no way to live. I think if you're trying to win games the way that Iowa State is.
Abu Sama had 16 carries for 276 yards in the snow against Kansas State. He had 12 carries for 4 yards in their bowl game. Right.
Yeah.
So it's like good Iowa State is good, but like gotta tell you, Bill, good Iowa State is good, but is Iowa State good? There's a national show sometimes. It's just like plug in the name. Like, it's like Mad Libs. It's like Team X is adjective. And I said it in an interesting voice. So I please, whenever I fall into that on this show, reach through the video and punch me in the neck. Jalen Noel and Jaden Higgins, their top 2 receivers, are back. I think all 5 offensive line starters are back. Their 4 leading pass catchers, like multiple running backs. TJ Tampa who was their best defensive player last year in the secondary. Yeah. He's gone, but that's kind of it. So this is not a spring to learn. They played a lot of young guys last year. So it really is the reverse. As much as I'm like, I don't know. I think Iowa State's going to be good. They were the reverse of Illinois, because Illinois wasn't that good and lost a lot of guys. Iowa State lost nothing and made a bowl, was pretty good.
Yeah.
Right. So I think there's a lot to like here, but it's basically improving on what they already have. So Rocco back to quarterback, and again, the multiple guys in the backfield, there's a lot to like. And so just get better this spring. Minnesota is next. Right? Minnesota is next. Mike, is that right? Minnesota? Oh, I got it right. They were 6-7 last year, 25 of their top 35 back. 3 new assistant coaches, including a new defensive coordinator because they lost Joe Rossi to Michigan State. Corey Heatherton is the new defensive coordinator for them. Spring start this week on March 21st, which is on Thursday. No spring game publicly for Minnesota this year. And I think the most interesting part of what they're trying to do is in the quarterback room, because they brought in Max Brosmer from New Hampshire, who was as good as anybody at that level last year. But it's beyond just the quarterback room this year. It's what they're maybe trying to build for the future, Bill, because like in 2019, when they really had it going, that was the good version of Tanner Morgan. Minnesota was 47th in the nation in passing yards per game in 2019. The last 4 seasons, this is where they've ranked in the nation in passing yards per game: 92nd, 118th, 116th, and 126th. So
Gross.
they need to throw it better. Now, maybe the reason they threw it really well in 2019 was because they had 2 NFL receivers in Tyler Johnson and Rashad Bateman, and it's like, find those guys again. But Tanner Morgan was never that version of Tanner Morgan again. A year ago, they were the only team in the Big Ten West that wasn't starting a transfer quarterback. They tried the development route. They tried to develop Ethan Kaliak-Manis, and last year wound up like okay. They were 5-7 and snuck into a bowl game. He transferred to Rutgers. So they're going the transfer route, but they have a double thing going, which is the best way to do quarterback transfers. Max Brosmer as the veteran from New Hampshire, but they also have a true freshman in Drake Lindsey, who was like a borderline top 25 national quarterback recruit. He was the Gatorade Player of the Year in Arkansas. And so they have both things going on in that quarterback room. So I'm curious this spring about them. How does Max Brosmer look jumping up? But also, is it the beginning of the development of Drake Lindsey, who maybe would then be the next guy up at Minnesota for multiple years as a starting quarterback?
Yeah, I think they're positioned to be better than they were last year. And I mention this like every time we talk about Minnesota. Like the big game they talked about, Ethan Kaliak-Manis, that like did not come to fruition at all. It's still a little confusing to me. Like what were they seeing? I guess like 2 years ago, last offseason, going into this past season, to make them feel so good about their quarterback situation, and then like to watch it unravel the way it did. Like it makes me question like, do they know what they're doing when it comes to developing quarterbacks and identifying quarterbacks a little bit? But like, you know, Brosmer really productive at the FCS level. I think some of that translates a little bit, and it's good to have a guy in the pipeline like Drake Lindsey. Like I would be fearful of playing Drake Lindsey early. I don't know if Minnesota is a place where you want to start a true freshman quarterback. So like if you can have like a bridge to him, I think that's actually set up really well, which I think is kind of the point you're making. But there's still going to be that thing in the back of my head of like, how much should we trust their quarterback evaluation when it was just like, it was so off last year?
Yeah. You know, at least they have a plan, right? And again, they didn't stand pat. They thought like a lot like Ohio State. They developed a quarterback. They started him for a year. It wasn't to the standard that they wanted. And so they made a change. And like Ohio State, they made a change in 2 ways. They brought in a transfer, and they have young guys that they want to start to develop. So I think I'm past the point. Do you have more respect for programs who develop quarterbacks as opposed to quarterbacks to programs who are going to be on the transfer quarterback merry-go-round every offseason? Do you still feel like, yeah, man, if you're developing your own guy, that's the better way to go? Or are you just like, I don't care how they do it, you've got to get a quarterback every year?
I still would like to. I would prefer that you recruit and develop guys rather than try to nail it every year in the transfer portal, because you're just going to miss. Like I think it's easier to miss when you're doing that than it is if you're developing your own guys.
We are, though, right now. We're talking about Minnesota and Ohio State in tandem, where they had, I think, by their own standards, developmental misses last year. So you can miss the other way too. So sure. I still agree with you, but I like once upon a time, maybe like 3 days ago, like almost like looked down on teams that were like, oh, you're in the transfer portal again for a quarterback. Yeah, good luck with that. But at some point, it's like, I don't know, Bo Nix and Michael Penix and Jaden Daniels and like what Oregon's doing right now, right? If your Oregon plan is like, we're going to get Bo Nix and Dylan Gabriel and guys like that every year, and because we're good and we either have the NIL ability or a winning program or good quarterback coaching or good offensive game planning, whatever it is, a chance to compete in the playoff, we're going to be attractive and we're going to get somebody. Like, I guess I don't think that's worse than, hey, we got a 5-star high school kid and we developed him for 2 years and then started him year 3. Right. So it's just like, to me, the thing that why this to me comes, I'm bringing this up now, is that you can miss in development too. You absolutely,
Sure.
Nebraska missed in the portal last year, but like year 1 of a coach with Matt Rule, Nebraska's up next. It's like, all right, well, you're grasping at straws. You're finding stuff. They miss in the portal. They have to make a quarterback change. So you can miss in the portal. You can also miss in your own room. So that's where Minnesota is now. But I always I think 2 quarterback paths at the same time is the best plan.
Yeah.
So
I think that's
if
right.
you have a transfer frontage road and the development highway, I still think I'd rather have that development highway and the transfer frontage road, right? Not the transfer highway, transfer interstate. Although Dan Lanning can be on the Oh, we should do this. Let's make a map, a northern map, and we draw roads in, and we would have the road from Oregon to Oklahoma called the Dan Lanning Transfer Interstate, right?
Yeah.
Like a little silly map that people who like Kings of the North. Oh, it's the placemat at the restaurant is our map.
There you go.
Our northern map is the placemat.
And it could be it could be like a little maze. Get your crowns out.
I am going to make a Kings of the North word search for next week's show. We're just going to get on and I'll be like, hey, what do you want to talk about? I didn't plan anything. I was working on the placemat word search for 38 hours last week.
The whole thing is just the South can cram it written a bunch of different ways.
And it's one of those diagonals, like a backwards diagonal that's like Haliac Manus. And it's like that. I saw that right away. You can't hide it from me. Because he's Minnesota and Rutgers. We'd have to have Haliac Manus in there. All right, let's go to Nebraska.
Right.
We're talking I don't mean to always talk about quarterbacks, but there are multiple teams again, in this sort of transfer world, there's more uncertainty at quarterback. So sometimes in the spring, there are legitimate, what's the number one thing in the spring? I want to look at quarterbacks. Nebraska's part of that too. The passing game, they have 25 of the top 35 back at Nebraska this year. They were 5-7 a year ago in year 1 for Matt Rule. We've talked about Matt Rule makes jumps in year 2. We're on alert for a jump. We like the over. We're talking Nebraska's an 8-9 win team this year. Only one new assistant, but that new assistant's really important. Starting next week, March 24th, spring game is on April 27th. And what I'm focusing on is building a passing game overall. And it's not only about true freshman quarterback Dylan Raiola, but they did some other things here to, I think, fortify this. And again, this is an admirable part of your quarterback planning, right? Is that we are going to not just throw a young kid out there and ask him to save us. We're going to have a plan for this. So one of the things they did, their new assistant is Glenn Thomas, who is the quarterback's coach. He's not going to be the play caller. And Matt Rule has really talked about the idea that he likes it if the quarterback's coach can only focus on the quarterbacks. So Glenn Thomas has worked with Matt Rule before. That's a new hire for this year. That's a big deal. Because this is we're going to bring you in and you're going to coach this 5-star freshman quarterback. And then they brought in 2 receivers in the transfer portal who might be their top 2 receivers. So you're building a structure to give your young freshman quarterback the best chance to succeed. So I want to see what that plan looks like starting this spring. It's not just a quarterback, it's a holistic passing game. And I think Nebraska's on the right track.
Yeah, I think they are. The addition of Isaiah Nair is one of the more intriguing transfer additions, I think, maybe in the country, because he just had such a weird path to Nebraska. He was so good at Wyoming. And he went to Texas, he blew out his knee. I think he only had 1 catch, I think, in Texas. He was there for 2 years. He had 1 catch. And he was, I don't know, one of the more productive receivers in college football at Wyoming prior to arriving at Texas. And it's is that still in there? Because if it is, then it's okay, this is a little interesting now at Nebraska. I think there's some potential explosivity with this passing attack that, yes, it's a freshman quarterback and there's going to be some volatility there too. I think you have to take that because it comes with the territory. But I like the environment they're trying to put Dylan Raiola in. It's probably still imperfect, and it's hard to say whether or not it's going to work because he's a true freshman, but they're not just like throwing him out there and saying like, hey, go make everybody else better, right? They are actually trying to put pieces around him, I think, to insulate him from some of the stuff you might encounter otherwise with starting a true freshman quarterback.
So Isaiah Nair, one of the receivers as a transfer that should start. The other is Jamal Banks, who had 59 catches for 653 yards last year at Wake Forest. He sort of made the rounds on some portal visits. Like a lot of schools were interested in him. So good plan. Good plan, right? I mean, the black shirts are still probably going to define Nebraska with what they do defensively. Dylan Raiola's uncle is the offensive line coach, so he is extra super invested in making sure the offensive line plays in a way to help protect the freshman quarterback. But I think this
awkward
is
Thanksgiving if Dominic Raiola's offensive line, gets Dylan Raiola hurt.
Yeah, can you imagine like the passive aggressive, like, I'm trying to think like what you would say. Like, I hope this stuffing doesn't get sacked on the way to you, uncle. Oh, Dylan, watch out. Yeah, that's not very good. What would be a good sack, a pass rushing joke? Because, like, for real, like, it'd be one of those. Can you imagine after Shadur Sanders got sacked 52 times last year at Colorado, if the offensive line coach was his uncle? Can you imagine what the Sanders Thanksgiving would have been like? What Prime would have been like carving the turkey? Being like, hey, Unc, I don't know if you get a slice. 52 sacks, man.
Yeah. Where's my seat? It's outside. Yeah. Have fun. You're going to sit outside in the cold.
Yeah.
Enjoy your mashed potatoes.
But I like it. But they have a plan, right? Bringing in a five-star freshman quarterback is not a plan. That's a player. Hiring a new quarterbacks coach, bringing in 2 starting receivers in the transfer portal, now you have a plan.
Yes.
So let's see what it starts to look like for Nebraska this spring. Next up is West Virginia. And we like West Virginia. We think West Virginia is going to be good. West Virginia won 9 games last year, had a great year. They gave Neil Brown, the head coach, a 1-year extension. 23 of their top 35 players back, 2 new assistants. March 25th is the start date for spring football, so that's next week. A little bit of time yet. April 27th is their spring game. And I focused on their secondary. Listen, this is a good team, right? Jaheim White at running back and Garrett Green at quarterback. And like that, I think the offense is going to be good. This is a really good football team that has a chance. But they did lose Beanie Bishop, who was an All-American cornerback last year as a 1-year guy at West Virginia. They lost their top 2 corners overall, and they lost their 3rd and 4th safeties. So they needed to do a little bit of a reset in the secondary. And to me, Bill, this is a sign of a good program, that West Virginia is in a place to win. They lost some guys in the secondary, and so they went and hit the portal in the secondary. And that included bringing in 4 new guys, Jaheim Joseph at safety from Northwestern, and Garrett Hollis from Northwestern as a corner, 2 other corners, including Ty Crandall from Colorado State, that a lot of schools were after, right? Like, this is what good programs do. You build it, then in the portal world, you have a hole, and so you aggressively patch it. So they've got to work these new secondary guys in. I think there'll be 2 or 3 new starters in the secondary from this transfer group. But like this to me is like the growth of a program of like, it's like, what are we doing in the portal? We don't have enough talent. It's like, no, we have a good team, but we're also not going to let like a couple departures blow a hole in our plans. We're going to immediately fix a problem before it starts. And it feels like to me, West Virginia did that, and they just got to work these guys in the spring.
Yeah, and I also feel like it's not even like addressing departures. It is like I think you need to be a little better probably than you were. Just like generally on defense, like that's where the step I think needs to happen for West Virginia if they're going to do what you and I think they're going to do this year. Like they were fine defensively last year, but they were, I think, like in the 80s in passing efficiency defense. Like good litmus test is like Penn State, who couldn't throw the ball against anybody, had 11.1 yards per attempt against West Virginia in the season opener last year. Like there were some teams that threw the ball a little bit on this defense last year. So it needs to, I don't think it needs to suddenly become like a top 10 passing defense, but they need to shore some things up. And it seems like they have a chance of doing that with the additions that they've made, because they're going to get tested again, right? With the schedule they're going to play this year. Like we like West Virginia, but they do play a tough schedule and they play some really good quarterbacks. So like you can't have that hole in your defense. You can't have kind of like an obvious vulnerability that I think is going to like keep you from achieving your goals this year. And I actually want, like, I don't know. I think you and I have conversations about West Virginia that are probably different than maybe a lot of the rest of the like we're pretty high on West Virginia, like what they could do this year. I don't know if there are a lot of people talking about like West Virginia playoff team, but they should be, and they will be if this defense can take a little bit of a step forward.
Yeah, we really like them. I was like, I go through, and I was like on the border of like, I don't think they have to do. I think they could cancel spring football. They're ready. They're good to go.
Yeah,
like no holes. So no, it's a good team. Like it's not. They got to play their best, right? Like this is one of these things. They are. I think a perfect example of, and like this is a tough spot. Iowa State for me a couple years ago was like this. There was a year that I picked Iowa State to make the playoff. But again, as I always say, like I think they wound up winning. I think they went 7-6 the year I picked them to make the playoff. But their quarterback was Brock Purdy, and their running back was Breece Hall. And it's like I don't know. They had NFL starters at the two most. Anyway, I'm going to stop eventually making excuses for my Iowa State love. But like they didn't play their best. You know what I mean? Like I thought like there were things in place for Iowa State that year, but when you're a program like Iowa State or West Virginia and you have things in place, you have to play at 110% of what you are. Like West Virginia at like 80%, even with all this back, is not making the playoff. Like West Virginia at 80% is going to be a 7-win bowl team, right? So you've got to maximize every part of you. But patching a hole before it shows itself, you can't get to week 4 and be like, oh man, our secondary is not very good, right? You've got to see that in December, and they did. So yeah. I like what they did. I want to see how these new guys work in the spring. All right, last break. When we come back, last couple teams to wrap up our spring football mega preview part 2 here on Kings of the North. Back now, moving on to Wisconsin on Kings of the North in our preview. If you did not watch it, did not listen to it, I would direct you to our conversation with Luke Fickell that we had last week, our first head coach guest here on Kings of the North. You know, we talked a lot about North versus South stuff, talked about what he's concerned about with the future of college football, but we did talk about the Badgers a little bit. One of the things about the Badgers is they will not be having a spring game because they're tearing up Camp Randall because they're putting in a heating system in the turf so that everybody can be nice and warm when they host LSU in a playoff game in 2 years. So no spring game.
Why are we doing that? Why are we doing that for the summer? We don't need to do that for LSU when they have to come to Camp Randall. Keep it cold.
What if like it feels like, I mean, if Wisconsin was like, we're putting in a sleet system in the under the turf. So like, even if it's not less than 32 degrees, our copyrighted sleet system allows you to create ice only when an SEC team is on offense. Right. So I don't know. Yeah. Maybe that would be, I should ask that. You should have been in on the interview. It's like,
sorry.
What are you doing?
What are you doing? Yeah.
We're leaning into the snow. We're not making it easier. Oh no, Tennessee's cold. Should we turn on the heat? Should we turn on the $12 million heating system? I don't know how much it actually costs. It's like, I can't find the switch. Like Luke goes down in the basement with like masking tape and is like, do not flip.
Yeah.
But anyway, so they can't have a spring game. March 25th, they will start spring practice next week. 4 new assistants. Good staff for Luke in year 1. How do you know? Because they lost assistants to Michigan, Notre Dame, and Alabama this offseason. So it was like, oh, I guess you hired some good guys. 20 of the top 35 guys in snaps back from a 7-6 team. One of the things I asked Luke Fickell on that show was like, I was just talking about like, I think offensive line health is like an underrated part of like how good your season's going to be. Mm-hmm. And, you know, they, for instance, had a guy, Jake Renfro, who Luke brought in, who had played for Luke Fickell at Cincinnati. He came last year. He got hurt right away. Didn't play last year until the bowl game. And I was sort of like, hey, like maybe that threw you off a little bit, offensive line health. And he's like, actually, I thought we were fine on offensive line health. He was a little worried last year about like, did they have enough? Like once, you know, Braylon Allen had some injury issues at running back and some like, do they have enough skill? So my question for Wisconsin this spring is, as they enter year 2 of the Phil Longo offensive experience, bringing some air raid principles to a traditional rushing attack, Are they going to have enough skill guys for all of this to sort of click into place, Bill? Because they do have Ches Malusi back, who got hurt last year as the number 2 running back. That's a big deal that he decided to stay in Madison. They have Will Pauling, their slot receiver, who was their leading receiver a year ago. They brought in Tyrell Henry from the portal from Michigan State. They were one of the schools that looked at Jamal Banks, who wound up at Nebraska. Like, this is, I think they need to, if you're going to try to throw it more, then you need to make sure you have enough people that they have they're 2 starting tackles back. Like Jack Nelson stayed at Wisconsin. That's a huge deal. Like they are, from an offensive line perspective, I think 4 of their top 5 are back, and they're getting Jake Renfro back. They're in a really good spot, but I don't think that's enough for Wisconsin offense anymore. There would have been a time when it's like, you got a back? Yeah. Yep. They always have a back. Is your offensive line experienced, ready to go? Yep. Okay. 10 wins. But I don't think that's the plan anymore. So they've got to have enough guys to throw the ball. We know Tyler Van Dyke's coming in as the quarterback from Miami, but I want to see what the skill looks like this spring.
Yeah, that's why you hired Luke Fickell, right? I get his defensive guy, but I think in some ways to like take that step forward on offense, like embrace, I think what you need to compete for championships, which is what like Wisconsin I think wants to do. Whether or not you think they're capable of it, I guess is up to you. But that's what they're trying to do as a program, and like you need more explosive players. You need an ability, I think, to be explosive, which I don't really think that Wisconsin probably has ever prioritized.
Right.
Prior to Luke Fickell's arrival, and it seems like they are now. It was actually like an underrated part of when Cincinnati went to the playoff under Luke Fickell and Mike Denbrock was their offensive coordinator there. Like they weren't like the greatest show on turf, but they were in terms of like 20+ yard plays, 30+ yard plays, like one of the more explosive offenses in the country. Like they had an ability to hit big plays, and I think that's where Wisconsin wants to get to. So maybe that's a more than like a 1-year process to get to that level, but it does seem like they are trying to make some moves to get themselves better positioned to do that this offseason, and they're going to have to keep doing it, I think, because like and they're probably still stuck in like a weird transition, right? You take over a program that's built to kind of ground and pound it, and you bring in an air raid-ish offensive coordinator. Like that's probably going to take a couple of years, but they need to be aggressive about addressing the personnel, because I don't think you can just like take what Luke Fickell inherited and like try to make an explosive offense out of it. You got to retool a little bit.
Bryson Green at receiver, 7 catches, 105 yards in the bowl game last year. CJ Williams, another young receiver, so that has a chance to step up. So they have some guys in the pipeline, but it's just like you got to see it, right? So. Do they have enough dudes to do what they want to do? And you think about like what Alec Pierce was as a receiver for that when Cincinnati was winning, right? Wound up being a high pick in the NFL. Like you've got to have some threats on the outside. So we'll see if Wisconsin can take the next step there this spring. All right, next up we are going to do Maryland, and to me this is all about Taulia Tagovailoa. They were 8-5 last year. They have only 19 of their top 35 back, which is not a ton. 2 new assistant coaches. They will start next week on March 26th with spring practice. Spring game is April 27th. And Taulia Tagovailoa is as defining of a Northern quarterback in the last 3 years as I think that you will find. He was 21-16 as a starter the last 3 years. He threw for more than 11,000 yards at Maryland. He threw 76 touchdown passes. This guy was like everything that Maryland was about, right? Like they had some good receivers. Rakim Jarrett and other guys run through there at different times. Like they've had some skill, but they like it felt like every year the question was like, is Taulia going to take a next step? So it was like, was he going to allow them to be a program that could compete with Ohio State and Michigan and Penn State and that kind of thing? And probably in the end, no. But he made him a winner. So this is one of those where I think in the moment, sometimes he established a level of competency that I felt like often the conversation around him was like, well, what else? What next? And if they don't have a quarterback play to that level this year, the conversation is very quickly going to turn to, oh man, remember when Taulia Tagovailoa was here? He was really good. So sometimes you don't appreciate a guy until he's gone. But life without Taulia, to me, is the thing I'm curious about this spring. MJ Morris, the transfer from North Carolina State, is the presumptive starter at quarterback. But I think there is, Mike Loxley is certainly making the noise of we're not handing the job over. There's some guys on the roster that they think are ready to compete with him. So Let's see what it looks like. You don't have in this day and age at a winning program a quarterback play 3 years in your program at that high of a level all that often, right? Like that's a long time and a lot of wins and a lot of yards for one guy. And now it's all new.
It is like he is. Taulia was like a polarizing quarterback, I suppose, because there were always those flashes that made you think like, oh man, like he's gonna help Maryland like jump up and get somebody, like get Michigan, get Ohio State, get Penn State, and then like oftentimes he kind of like turned in clunkers in those games. So there was an up and down nature to him that, like, I don't know, like the program kind of went as he went, but the floor was very high, as you said. Like they were a winner, and I don't know that they're going to get the baseline level of competency at quarterback that's going to allow them to continue to be a bowl team. I think that's very much in question. I'm a little concerned too by the fact that they went out and got MJ Morris, only because like a lot of the guys that are also in the competition have been in this program for a number of years. Like I think Billy Edwards is a transfer from USF. I think who's been in the program for like 3 years. Cam Edge, I think, has been in the program for 3 years. And it's like you're so unsure about guys that have been in your quarterback room for that long. They had to go out and get another transfer to replace Taulia. So I don't know. Like MJ Morris has like tools that like are enticing. Like I totally get that, and we talked about him when we did the quarterback show. Like I think there's reason to be a little bullish on what he could become, but I don't know maybe if we're ready to be that immediately for Maryland. So there could be like, I think to your point, maybe like some hard lessons learned here about just how difficult life without Taulia might be. And I'm not saying like Taulia wasn't the best quarterback in the Big Ten year after year, although like some years statistically he was kind of like right there. But we don't appreciate, I think, enough like just like high floor players. I think we get infatuated with ceiling, which I totally get, but like sometimes competency matters too. and Maryland just lost a guy who I think was pretty competent at quarterback.
Yeah, the way to stop the conversation about when is Maryland going to beat Ohio State or Michigan is to start losing your 3 non-conference games into Indiana and Rutgers every year, right? And then it's like, oh, now we're just trying to make sure we're not 2-10 and we're not worried about Ohio State. So Billy Edwards Jr. did start in the bowl game after Tagovailoa opted out. He was the MVP. They beat Auburn. He threw for 126 yards and ran for 50 and was the MVP. He had started a couple other games the last couple of years when Tagovailoa was hurt. So he's around. Jaden Sauray is a guy that I think some people are excited about. So like, again, they're making the noise of a competition, but they also looked at what they had. And here we are again, quarterback development versus transfer. Ideally, right? Your backup quarterback would be the guy, hey, he's been developing him. He's made a couple starts. He's ready to go. But they looked at the situation and decided to go get somebody. So they maybe aren't handing the job over, but they also weren't 100% sure about what they had. So what does this quarterback room look like is certainly worth keeping an eye on for Maryland when they get spring started next week. All right, we're going to move down the road to Rutgers. Rutgers, 3 new assistant coaches. Their tight ends coach got the Harvard job. So they lost that guy. Isn't that crazy? It's like, hey,
he's wicked smart. Good for him.
What? I guess you probably do have to be smart to be the Harvard coach, right?
I don't think you could. Yeah, I don't think you can be a dummy and coach Harvard. Like the football players are still Harvard students. Yeah.
You know, he's got to be worried about what they might unionize, right? You got to watch out for those unions in the Ivy League. We're not talking about that on this show because we like to talk about sports, not labor disputes. 24 of their 35 back, a lot back. Starting next week with spring practice, spring game on April 27th. And I am ready for the next step for Rutgers football. I think this is their year. It might be why they went out and brought in Ethan Kalakmanis from Minnesota to compete with Gavin Wimsatt at quarterback. They have Kyle Monungai stayed as one of the best running backs in the Big Ten last year. But this is, if this program gets back to what it was at its heights under Greg Schiano here in Greg Schiano Part 2, it's going to be done defensively. And I think they have a chance to have a top 20 defense this year with everything they have back. And they have to start showing that this spring. So when I say that the issue for them is, can they be a dominant defense? And can that be what they put out there in March and April? Does that make sense to you, or is that too ambitious for Rutgers?
No, I'm with you. They're sixth in the country in returning defensive production. They're old. I was looking at, I want to give proper credit, the Night Report, the rival site that covers Rutgers, looking at their projected depth chart for 2024. 10 of the 11 starters they project on defense are fourth year or older.
Yep.
So I think this should be a top 20 defense. So like there's always a question, right, of like what's a top 20 defense in the Big Ten, because some of the offenses I think can help you get there depending on, and it's different now too because East to West don't exist anymore. So that conversation becomes a little more nuanced, I think. They were pretty good last year. Like I thought that like there was one of the stingier defenses in the country in terms of giving up big plays. They didn't give up a ton of them. They were like passing efficiency defense. They were top 25 in the country. They were top 50 defense, I think, kind of overall. It's probably a fair way to describe them. So to be a top 50 defense, bring basically everybody back. I think top 20 is not a lofty goal at all.
So when they bottomed out, okay, so this is the Brian Fremo Index, the FEI ratings that we like to use as an efficiency rating. When Greg Schiano's last year in 2011, they were a 9-4 team, and in the FEI index, they were the number 14 defense in the country. And then the first year after Greg Schiano was gone, when Kyle Flood was there, and like you can always run on the fumes of the successful head coach the year before, at least for a year, they were the 13th defense. So that was the last time they were a top 20 defense in the FEI. Okay. Since then, very quickly, their overall defensive ranking in the nation: 92, 66, 116, 72, 58, 74, 114 in 2019, which is the year Chris Hash got fired. Okay. The last 4 years, this is the return of Schiano: 57, 61, 48, 43. So that is great progress and gradual progress every year. Slightly better, right? From 114. Time for a jump. So you're exactly right. They were a top 50 defense. Let's be a top 20 defense. Flip Dixon at safety, Mohamed Toure at linebacker, Aaron, I always get him confused. Aaron Lewis or Aaron Casey?
Lewis.
Aaron Lewis.
Aaron Casey is Indiana,
right?
Yep.
He left, but like that's okay. That's going to happen. I'm going to get my Northern Aarons confused sometimes. Aaron Lewis on the defensive, like they have a star at each level, right? There's like they have depth, they have ceiling, they have coaching. Like there is so much here. I think this is a year to jump up and get somebody, but I think we're not talking about the season yet. I think Rutgers should come out of the spring like ravenous. Like they should have guys, I don't know, dressing up in night costumes and running through the streets of New Brunswick. Right? I think they need to come out of spring with an attitude of, we're going to be a top 10 defense and a top 25 team. You do not want to play us this year because we are going to have an excellent defense and Kamanunga is going to run you over. And I think like they're going to chop wood, like they're going to chop so much wood, they're going to build 10 houses this spring.
Yeah.
So this is it. Like if we're playing the game of like, who's the Northern Washington this year? I think it's Rutgers. I want Rutgers to be simultaneously the Iowa of the East and the Washington of the East, because I want them to play great defense with perhaps mediocre offense. And I want them to be old. And like that formula, like if I'm not going to say the phrase 10-win Rutgers team, not in March, but I want Rutgers to come out of spring saying the phrase 10-win Rutgers team.
I think mediocre offense might be optimistic.
Okay. I know their quarterback situation is like 24th in the North. I know, but this is Schiano. Schiano knows. So he's like, okay, we had one quarterback we're not sure about. So let's go get Minnesota's quarterback who they're not sure about. So at least we'll have two guys we're not sure about. Two guys
we don't know whether or not they can play. Yeah, it's great.
And they can just like, they're going to play the hot hand. Like they might substitute in the middle of a play, right? If Ethan Kaliak-Manis drops back to pass and there's nobody open, they might substitute Gavin Wimsatt mid-play and have him try to scramble. So yes. And Kamanunga might get 46 carries a game this year.
Yeah.
So I hope he has like a good NIL package because he might be a shriveled torso by the time he gets to the NFL if he has 415 carries in his last college season. But like this defense, brother, like I'm ready for good reports out of Rutgers.
Do you want to call your shot now? Rutgers' third game of the year. They have to go to Blacksburg to play a Virginia Tech team that I think people see as like a dark horse in the ACC. Instead of Rutgers win.
We could put that on the line. We can tell Virginia Tech that if they beat Rutgers, we'll take them. We'll make them a Northern team. And if not, that's how we're going to operate here. If they win, they're North. If they lose, they're South.
They're South.
But we're all about. So they add Rutgers to the list of teams that I am preternaturally excited about this year. I think my list is officially Iowa, West Virginia, and now Rutgers. Is that fair? I think that's my list.
Those are your guys. Yeah.
Those are my guys.
Yeah.
Can we throw in an unexpected, what do we think of the Kadyn Proctor situation with Iowa losing its 2-month left tackle, the 5-star who's from Iowa, who started at left tackle for Alabama last year? He transfers home after Nick Saban retires, and he announces this week that he's already leaving Iowa, and everybody expects him to transfer back to Alabama. I think this should not be allowed. Like, I think this is the line in the sand to me of like, players can't always do whatever they want to do. I don't think you should be able to transfer again 2 months later. This is a mistake. And it's one of these things like people say like, hey, well, what about regular students can do it? I'm not sure regular students can do this because when you want to transfer schools, they have to admit you. Right. And like, hey, I just transferred away from you. Can I transfer back? If you're not a 320-pound future first-round pick at left tackle, they might not let you in. So this is not,
or it's not as easy. It's not as easy, at least.
Like, can you imagine him showing up at like the bursar's off or whatever the administrative offices of like, I have my transcript. Can I transfer? And they're like, I don't know, man. You just left. And then they look up and he like blocks out the sun. And it's like, yeah, you're good.
Yeah.
Kellen DeBoer's like, he's good, right? He's good, right? He's good, right? Isn't it weird? Like what?
It is weird.
Information. What do we think of this?
I'm unclear as to how he is eligible to play right away at Alabama. Does this not count as another transfer? Like, I don't.
Anybody's allowed to do anything.
Yeah, no.
There's no rules. There's no rules.
I'm in favor. I'm very much in favor of player empowerment. Certainly in college football, because for too long they didn't have any. But this feels like a step too far. Like I don't really like, short of like serious family situation that requires you to do something like this. Like certainly I can get on board with that kind of idea, but I don't think that's what's happening because Kadyn Proctor is leaving home to go back to Alabama. So I agree with you that shouldn't be allowed. It sucks for Iowa. It sucks that a lot of people at Iowa like put a lot of money on the table to get Kadyn Proctor to come to them in the first place, and they don't get that money back because that's not how this NIL world works. So yeah, I don't love it. I was really excited to watch Kadyn Proctor play at Iowa, and for that kind of player to come back and play at home and play in the North, and it's a bummer that's not going to happen now.
Do you believe, you and I had a social media conversation, do you believe that he just does not want to deal with the pressure of playing for a presumed playoff team, so he's leaving Iowa to go back to Alabama where there's less pressure this year?
Yeah, there's less expectation. I think it's that, and also he was looking forward to playing in the Brian Ferentz offense, and now he can't, so he's just going to go back to Alabama. Yeah.
It is possible that I single-handedly ruined Kadyn Proctor's chances of succeeding at Iowa because I pumped him up so much. He was like, "This is too much."
I can never live up to it. This guy thinks we're going to the playoffs.
Yeah. All right, we're going to wrap up with Washington, who is like, if you thought they lost a lot. 14-1, made the national title game last year. They have 8 of their top 35 players in snaps from last year back. 8. 20 is normal. Iowa State has like 28. Washington has 8. They have a new head coach and all new assistants. They aren't starting spring football until April 2nd. Which is the latest, which is why they're last here. They are playing their spring game on May 3rd, which is the latest in the North, which is why they're last here. This is one of these. They made a big deal. They moved their spring game to a Friday night. They made a cool graphic with purple ghost-like Huskies, right? They've made a big deal about having coaching clinics. I think Bill Belichick's going to speak at their coaching clinic because Bill Belichick's kid, Steve Belichick, is their defensive coordinator. Pete Carroll's kid, Brennan Carroll's their offensive coordinator. They've made a huge deal about that offense. Once I looked this up, I love what Jed Fish is doing because it has to be all the show. It's all about ghost-like Husky graphics and having Bill Belichick at your coaching convention because there's no there. 8 of your top 35. And also, it's not like the whole Arizona team followed Jedd Fisch to Washington. If Noah Fafita was there, it'd be like, okay, well, they don't have a lot back, but Noah Fafita might throw for 320 yards a game. That didn't happen. So everybody, and people maybe initially thought that would. Everybody followed Curt Cignetti. Like they need some JMU. Could Curt Cignetti share some of his guys? This is if you ordered the Washington special. Last year, the Washington special, when you ordered it, you got like a full plate. It was overflowing. We still call it the Washington special. It's the same price. And when we bring it to your table, it's an empty plate. There's nothing here. And it's not their fault. So this is one of those, like, I'm not making fun of Washington. I'm not blaming Washington. But there's a cost.
Yeah.
This offseason, I think, has really proven this. There's a cost to winning. And there's a motivation to losing, right? And so on like Washington and Michigan, both are paying the costs of their unbelievable seasons, but at least they got there. We talked about Illinois. Illinois lost a lot, didn't get anywhere. Washington and Michigan lost a lot, but they got to the top, man. So this is just like a complete do-over. And then in the back of my mind, thanks to you, the seed of like, they're going to start the rebuild, and then Jedd Fisch is going to leave after a year, and they're going to have to start the rebuild again. So I just want Washington football fans to enjoy this crazy new world in the Big Ten. You're playing new opponents. You're having new teams and new uniforms visit your stadium. Enjoy that part of it because they're hollowed out, brother, in a way that like I don't even know what to talk about.
Do you think they're going to bottom out? Like, Jedd Fisch first year at Arizona, they went 1-11. And granted, Arizona was a bad team that he took over, but when he had to rebuild that program, they were terrible their first year. But I think there's a baseline of talent here in Washington. Like bottoming out might look like 500. I think maybe.
Yeah, I don't know because like I'm not going to pretend I'm an expert on the full top to bottom Washington roster in every way, but part of the issue is they were an older team than we'd really ever seen before while they were winning last year. But then with the coaching transition, they lost so many transfers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. They lost 9 transfers out of their top 35. Oregon, Ole Miss, Oklahoma, Miami, Florida, and 2 to Alabama. Like good programs were plucking the roster clean. Jabbar Muhammad's one of the best corners in the West, one of the best corners in the North. The West doesn't exist anymore. One of the best corners in the North. He went to Oregon. They still had Jabbar Muhammad, right? That'd be quite a different thing. If they still had, Misha Powell, who went to Miami, that'd be a different thing. Jeremy
Parker
Bernard
Brailsford.
would be like maybe they're one of their best players with the ball in his hands. He went to Alabama. Parker Brailsford should be their center. He's Alabama's center. Like this is like that's what we're talking about here. The double whammy of that. You're super old, gone. Your coach leaves, a bunch of guys transfer, and then your new coach doesn't bring his entire former team with him. I do think like they might bottom out in a way that like everybody kind of knows this. I think they could be staring down the barrel of 2-10. And it's not a reflection. This is a team. This is a 2024 team conversation. It is not a program conversation. It does not mean Jedd Fisch, if he stays, can't get it going. It does not mean that Washington is not going to be a factor in the Big Ten in the future. It means right now, in this specific scenario, I don't think we've ever seen a roster stripped bare quite like this because it was oversized last year, and now it's a skeleton, and the birds are picking at every scrap of meat, man.
Yeah, it is. The double whammy is interesting. I hadn't really heard it kind of presented that way, but if they were able to, keep some of those transfers, not even all of them, just like some of them, like it's a drastically different outlook, I think, for this season. Because Will Rogers, a quarterback, I think he's a decent quarterback, but who's going to block for him? Who's he going to throw to? Right? It's like he's going to be out there. He's going to be out there by himself. There are a couple of good players from Arizona that did come with Jedd Fisch. So I think I'd be surprised by like a true bottoming out, like a 2-win season. But I do think that this is a pretty hard reset. Like a winning season, I think could be hard to come by with how much this roster has turned over.
I just like fans just have to chuckle through it, right? So
Yeah.
they're having like a big launch for spring football. Like I get it. Like be enthusiastic, be supportive, be optimistic, but be realistic and understand that the season Washington had last year, probably 22 of the 26 teams in the North would kill for a season like that and an experience like that. And they really did maximize it. Right. Again, to be in this spot and to think like, oh man, if only Washington hadn't lost to Oregon in the Pac-12 title game, imagine what they could have done. They made the national title game, man. Awesome. Mm-hmm. People be talking about Michael Penix and Roma Dunze and Jalen Polk and Dylan Johnson and Braylon Trice and Jabbar Muhammad and all those guys. I'll be talking about them forever. So a lot of great memories, but you might have to be like looking in your phone a lot. You might be in the stadium looking in your phone, being like, it was a fun watch party for the national title game. Like, what is it? Oh, it's 31-3. Man, I got so drunk, right? Last year was drunk good. This might be drunk tough.
Drunk to get through it. Yeah.
That's also on the menu. That's on our drinks menu. Do you want
what kind of drunk do you want to get?
Drunk tough or drunk to get through it? Like that's the sizes, right? It's like a 12-ounce beer is drunk good, 16-ounce beer is drunk tough, and like the 40-ouncer is the drunk to get through it. There are people watching and listening who are like, for real, when are you opening? I know, right?
The line is already around the block. Yeah.
Failed show, successful restaurant. Possible. I was a really good, I'm not here to brag. I was an excellent busboy. I can carry a lot of stuff. I'm very stable.
Where did you bus?
I busted like a fancy hotel restaurant where I had to wear a bow tie.
Nice.
Scoop the butter in little balls. I love to make a butter ball. Oh my God. It's so soothing. Like,
butter balls are also on the menu.
Are they deep fried? Nope.
Nope.
Do they come with bread? Nope.
Absolutely not.
Just pop them. Boop. 10? You want to get 10 butter balls? Just pop them in our mouth. Right? Everybody, when you were a kid, didn't you just stick your finger in the butter and eat it? Everybody's done that, right?
Of course. Yeah.
And at some point, society says no more. At Kings of the North, we say, oh, yes. 10 butter balls and a drunk to get through it, please. All right. Well, if we don't spend our whole week planning menus, we'll be back next week with a couple more shows. But we've now done it. If you are a fan, particularly of one of these 26 teams in the North, and you're like, wait, if we didn't talk about them today, we talked about your team on the previous show. So go find that. We hope we informed you about some of the other teams in the North because we think you guys all have something in common. And, Georgia has spring football too, but we don't care about that. So we always appreciate you guys making Kings of the North part of your week. Thanks as always to our great producer, Mike Hirostowski. Makes us look good and sound good. For Bill Landis, I'm Doug Lesmerises, and that was Kings of the North.